Welcome, everyone. My name is Victoria Cook. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm one of the members of the Executive Committee of USA for Israeli Democracy. Many thanks to all of you, the hundreds of participants of this webinar, for caring about democracy and for joining our discussion today. Thank you also to the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been protesting in the streets for 32 straight weeks to keep Israel a vibrant democracy. USA for Israeli Democracy is a grassroots group focused on US-based actions to support democracy in Israel. You can scan, if you can see it properly from my screen, our QR code, if you would like to join us. We've organized letter writings to Congress, to President Biden, and to Jewish organizations. We've held informational Zooms, such as the one last week with Dr. Ido Baum and Thomas Friedman, and next week we have one with Ehud Barak. We have co-organized and co-sponsored rallies here in the US and advocated for donating to the protests in Israel. And we disseminate information to community activists and to the public in our social media channels, which are linked in that QR code. Our website and YouTube channel provide accurate, responsible, and the most comprehensive information in English about the judicial overhaul and the protest movement. USA for Israeli Democracy is not affiliated with any other existing group or political organization in the US. We are left, right, secular, religious, Israeli expats, and US born, all working together for one goal: protecting Israel's democracy. We collaborate closely with the protest movement in Israel, and the entire effort is volunteer-based. We very much thank our contributors, translators, and web and social media curators for their dedication and hard work. Today, we are pleased to host Amir Tibon and Yossi Klein Halevi to help us understand how the democracy crisis in Israel is affecting the Israeli-American political relationship and the relationship between Israelis and American diaspora. We will start with Amir and then move to a discussion with Yossi. During the webinar, you are invited to send your questions using the Q&A feature. So hi, Amir, we'll start with you. I'm going to give you a little bio of you. Amir Tibon is the diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. He was previously the paper's correspondent in Washington. His writing on Israel and the Middle East has been published in The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and other US leading publications. Amir lives today in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, located on the Israeli border with Gaza, together with his wife and 2 daughters. So hi, Amir, thank you so much for joining us. We know that you hopefully are going to give us an update on kind of where we are now post the legislation passing, the Knesset being on vacation, and the upcoming actual Supreme Court hearings that are happening very, very soon, where we'll have our the Marbury versus Madison moment for Israel. So we're looking forward to you helping us know where we are today.
All right, well, thank you very much, Victoria, for this great introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this great and important webinar. And hi, Yossi, it's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say in a few minutes. I'm going to start, like Victoria said, with a bit of an overview of where we stand right now. It's easy to get lost in all the noise and the headlines. And there is a lot happening in Israel these days. I mean, just today, it is August and it's raining in my kibbutz, which is something I don't remember in many, many years. But, you know, apart from that, there is real craziness in the country. So I'll try to summarize a bit where we stand at this moment. This government led by Netanyahu, and really, you can argue actually led by his far-right ultra-religious coalition partners, started with a very clear goal of redefining the balance between the authorities in Israel and twisting it to a place where the government has almost absolute power and there are no real checks and balances holding it back. The Israeli system as it exists today is imperfect and there are many ways to improve it. Giving the government absolute powers and stripping away the ability of the Supreme Court to act as the only effective check and balance is probably, in the opinion of many Israelis, not the greatest way to do it. But they had a very clear plan in the beginning. And now we are in August. It's been, 7.5 months to the existence of this government, and we can look a bit back and see what they have achieved so far from this plan. And I'm going to look at three pieces of, well, actually 2 pieces of legislation and 1 executive action that they have taken so far. And then I will describe how the court system is now being asked to treat these 3 movements that we've already seen happen. So action number 1 happened in March, when the government, the majority in the Knesset, which, you know, in our system acts together with the government as one, passed a law making it almost impossible to declare a prime minister in Israel incapacitated or unable to perform his or her duties. This is something that has not attracted as much attention as the other pieces of legislation that the government is promoting, but it's actually pretty important. What this law that is already passed and is now the law of the land in Israel says is that only a majority of 90 out of 120 members of the Israeli Knesset can declare a prime minister unfit to serve. This is, you know, a very high bar, of course, 3/4 of the Knesset. And the law does not include any kind of provisions or special cases. Like, for example, you can imagine a prime minister being very sick and being in the hospital and unable to function physically. We've had it before here in Israel, tragically, with Ariel Sharon 2 decades ago. We've had some interesting incidents recently with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had some kind of a heart event and needed to have a pacemaker installed. He looks healthier these days, and we wish him to remain healthy and strong. But you know, the health issues of prime ministers are always something that should be discussed by medical professionals, and this new law says that in order to declare that a prime minister can no longer, even on the physical level, serve, there needs to be a 90 Knesset member consensus around it. This law actually comes to serve a different purpose. It comes to shield Benjamin Netanyahu from one of his biggest fears, which is that the Attorney General of Israel will declare him unfit or incapacitated, unable to serve, because he is in contempt of court. The background to this, I'll really try to summarize it. It's a bit, you know, I don't want to go into too much details, but 3 years ago, there was a petition to the Supreme Court of Israel to declare Netanyahu unfit to be prime minister because of his criminal indictment. The Supreme Court, which Netanyahu and his supporters like to describe as some leftist, anti-Netanyahu institution, ruled 11-0 that Netanyahu is able to serve and decided to reject this petition. However, the judges did ask Netanyahu to sign some kind of conflict of interest agreement that bars him from taking action related to the judicial system, because it does not make sense that a person who is under criminal indictment will lead all kinds of reforms and changes that have to do with the judicial system. And when his new government that he's been leading or co-leading for the last several months began now its judicial overhaul, Netanyahu decided that he wants to get involved in the dealings around this issue, and he was afraid that the Attorney General would come and say, Mr. Prime Minister, you cannot do this. If you are getting involved in the judicial overhaul, you are breaking your own conflict of interest agreement, which was the condition of the court to reject those petitions 3 years ago against your continued presence as prime minister, and therefore I will declare you unable to serve. I think the situation where this will actually happen is extremely unlikely. I think it's more of a personal paranoia of Netanyahu, but still this law was passed by his coalition in March. Again, it sets an impossible bar for ever taking this kind of action against a prime minister, even in an absurd situation where a prime minister will be very sick and unable to perform their duties. There has been an appeal to the Supreme Court against this law, and the judges are going to hear it in a few weeks. And based on how it's been discussed so far, there's been some kind of a preliminary hearing. They may decide to postpone the durability of this law until the next Knesset, basically until after the next Israeli election, so that the law does not serve a personal purpose of a criminal defendant, which is Netanyahu. The second thing that the government has succeeded to do so far is to pass the law that was passed 3 weeks ago, canceling the reasonableness standard over government decisions in Israel. This is something you probably heard about more than the previous example I gave, because there was a lot of political drama around this one here in Israel. Here in Israel, the reasonableness standard is a tool that is used by the courts in many different cases. For example, when there are discussions that have to do with accidents or with the medical claims and things like that, a lot of times the court will try to look at a given situation and examine whether an action taken by a citizen or a construction company or a medical doctor or a police officer is a reasonable action given the circumstances. Of course, this is, you cannot clearly define it in 100% of the cases by law, but I just want to point out that today, Yossi and I, as Israeli citizens living in Israel, are still bound to act reasonably in certain cases. And if an action that we will take, I mean, Yossi, I think, is not even in the category, but maybe for me, I will do something extremely unreasonable that will cause damage to others, the extreme unreasonableness of my actions could serve against me in court. After the law that was passed 3 weeks ago, there is only one institution in Israel that can act extremely unreasonably and will not face any consequences for this in court. That institution is the Israeli government. The government basically now can take decisions, and the court has lost the ability to conduct judicial review over those actions using the tool of unreasonableness. There are still other tools with which the court can conduct a judicial review over executive decisions, but the reasonableness standard was very important for all kinds of extreme cases. I'll give one small example from the area of Israel where I live, the Gaza border area. In 2007, the government of Ehud Olmert at the time wanted to relieve itself of the duty of providing adequate shelter from bombs from Gaza to school children in the Gaza border area. They thought that there was not sufficient budget for it. And people who live in this area, in the Gaza border area, appealed to the Supreme Court and asked the court to reverse the government's decision because it's extremely unreasonable not to provide adequate shelter from bombs and mortars from Gaza to school children. And indeed, the Supreme Court decided that the government's action in this case was extremely unreasonable and forced the government to provide the funding for the shelters. On this issue of the canceling of the reasonableness standard for government decisions, and this also includes decisions by individual ministers, by the way. So, for example, a minister can make very, very controversial, very unreasonable appointments to the professional staff in their ministry, and the court will not really have the ability to say this is an extremely unreasonable appointment and strike it down. This issue will come before the Supreme Court also in about a month, and the Chief Justice of Israel, Esther Chayut, decided for the first time in decades to hold the hearing over this piece of legislation in front of the entire court. 15 justices will sit and hear the arguments in favor and against striking out this law. It will be a very important and watershed moment. I liked Victoria's comparison to Marbury versus Madison, because basically the petitions against this legislation are asking the court to nullify what we call in Israel a basic law. Israel does not have a constitution, as I assume most of people in the audience know, but we have a set of basic laws that are supposed to be some kind of a draft for a future constitution. The problem is that writing a basic law and passing it through the Knesset is very easy to do. It is completely different than, let's say, adding an amendment to the US Constitution, which is a monumental task. You need 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, and then you send it to the states, and I think you need 3/4 of the different states to approve it. Here in Israel, in order to pass a basic law, you need the coalition majority that exists in the Knesset to call a law basic, and that's it. So theoretically, tomorrow morning, they can pass a law that Yossi Klein Halevi and Amir Tibon are not allowed to do webinars with people in the United States. And if they call it basic law, from the point of view of this government, it will be shielded from any kind of judicial review, even though the law itself did not pass any kind of special majority, did not go through any special legislative process. But still, the Supreme Court historically in Israel has been very cautious on interfering with basic laws, because in the past there was more respect for the process of legislating basic laws, and it was something that, since the Knesset did not mess with the basic laws every Wednesday and Tuesday, the court also tried to give them a different standing. I'm not sure if that will survive the current test. And the last thing the government has done, and after that I'll pass it on to Yossi, is an executive action, not a piece of legislation. The government has refused for 7.5 months now to convene Israel's Judicial Appointments Committee. We have a committee here in Israel that is responsible for appointing judges through all the ranks of the court, from the transportation court to the Supreme Court. And ever since this government has taken office, Yariv Levin, the justice minister, has refused to convene the committee. Of course, he's doing it because he wants to pressure the judicial system and the opposition to agree to his ideas of giving the government an absolute majority on this committee, and then by that giving the government the power to appoint all the judges in the country on all the ranks of the court through its own interests exclusively. And there has been a petition to the Supreme Court to force Yariv Levin's hand to convene the Judicial Appointments Committee, which will also be heard next month. So what I'm trying to say with all of that is that we are reaching a point of great drama within a few weeks. Because if even in one of these three cases, the court will rule against the government, or, whether it's striking down one of the laws, delaying one of the laws into the next Knesset, or forcing the government to convene the Judicial Appointments Committee in its current form, where the government does not have a majority, we could potentially face a situation where the government refuses to comply. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, in several interviews to the US media recently, refused to give a clear answer whether or not he will respect a court order that goes against his own policy. That will lead us to a constitutional crisis. It will make the crisis that we are currently seeing within the military and the social and political crisis in Israel 10 times worse. And I don't even want to imagine the impact it could have on the US-Israel relationship at a time when we've already heard President Biden and members of Congress and senators speak out against some parts of Netanyahu's legislative plan. A situation where there is a refusal to accept a court decision would put us in uncharted territory. And with that dose of optimism, I'll pass it along to Yossi.
So thank you, Amir, for that really thorough and somewhat chilling summary of where we are now. It actually is a great transition to Yossi, who has spent a lot of his career. First of all, he is an American Ola, right? So he has a unique perspective on both the American community and the Israel community. And I'm going to just give a quick bio, which is Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He is co-host, together with Danielle Hartman and Alana Steinhain, of the Hartman Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller and has appeared in 12 languages. Born in Brooklyn, he received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who helps direct a Center for Jewish Meditation. They have 3 children. So Yossi, I've read a lot of your work. I'm a regular listener to For Heaven's Sake, and I've recently read a very powerful essay that was published in the Times of Israel, where you talk quite a bit about how we got to where we are culturally in all the different aspects of, I think you call them the tribes of Israel. And so a lot of my questions are kind of based in where you have been speaking lately about all of those issues. So my first question is pretty simple in a way. After 75 years, we've really created Israelis, right? We have an Israeli society now, which in many ways is very different than diaspora Jews. But we also have a very different America right now. We have a much, much more progressive youth in American Jews. Not all of them are as engaged with Israel or even pro-Israel. And we're kind of coming to a place where the more and more Israel's politics, official politics, are to the right, the more and more it's alienating a lot of American Jews, especially the younger generation. So even if we get to a point where America continues to have the quote unquote special relationship with Israel, despite everything for its own geopolitical interests in the region, how can we think about making sure that the kesher, the connection between the galut, the US diaspora, and the Israelis, Jews, are still, as I always learned growing up in day school, Am echad, ish echad, belev echad, one people with one, as if one man with one heart. How do we make that still true?
So first of all, it's good to be with you, Victoria. And Amir, thank you for the terrific presentation and for your voice. I depend on you. And thank you, USA for Israeli Democracy, Shaul, and all of you for the just terrific work you're doing. So when we, Victoria, when we look at the American Jewish-Israeli relationship, in some ways, the very fact that these two communities have been in a relationship at all is a kind of miracle, because we are so fundamentally different from each other. And I've lived in Israel now for more than 40 years. And when I go back to my periodic visits to the American Jewish community, it takes me a while, even though I grew up there, it takes me a while to adjust. And we're different in so many ways, but just the most basic difference is really our circumstances. American Jews, with the rise in anti-Semitism, nevertheless remain the most secure and accepted diaspora in Jewish history. And Israel, of course, until relatively recently, was rejected by almost the entirety of our region. And so each community developed a very different, really an opposing strategy for coping with its circumstances. American Jews became open, flexible, developed forms of Judaism that were suitable for the American conditions. And in Israel, we developed forms of political and cultural responses to our environment, which helped us cope by being the toughest kid on the block, really in some ways the very opposite of the American Jewish way of relating to its environment. And for me, a healthy starting point in rethinking the American Jewish-Israeli relationship is for each community, first of all, to recognize the necessity and even more so the wisdom of each Jewish community's response to its very particular circumstances. Israelis don't understand that American Jews, when Israelis see American Jews, they see a community that's betraying Jewish history, that's assimilating, and they don't understand what it means to navigate a Jewish identity in an environment that embraces it. We've never experienced anything like that before. And so I look at the American Jewish community as this heroic enterprise that's trying to figure out how to be Jewish without the necessity of relying on self-ghettoization, which of course is the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox strategy. So, and in terms of the Israeli response, until this government, which I consider to be not a normative Israeli government. I don't consider this to be a morally legitimate government. But until this government, I would say that Israeli governments operated within a broad, morally justified framework of responding to ongoing existential threat. And so each community needs to not look at the other through its own experience, but to really try to understand the nature of the other community's experience, and really to celebrate the ways, the various ways, even opposite ways of coping that are expressions, I think, of the Jewish wisdom of survival, which we've developed over thousands of years. What worries me about the relationship today is really what you were indicating, but I would expand that, because I see the problem not only on the American Jewish side, but also on the Israeli side. Excuse me. You know, I grew up in a synagogue in Brooklyn that had the two flags on the bima, the Israeli flag and the American flag. And for my generation growing up, we just assumed that those two flags were there naturally. And the entwinement of those two flags and what those two flags represented, which was on the one hand, Jewish continuity, and on the other hand, democratic values, was really that was the foundation of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. Today, we're seeing strong forces within each community working to undermine the relationship between those two flags, between the values that those two flags represent. In Israel, we're seeing more and more young people rejecting the necessity of democracy. Why do we need to hinder ourselves when we're fighting a constant war against terrorism, when periodically we find ourselves in wars on multi fronts? Democracy is a luxury for countries that aren't facing existential threat. And you're hearing more and more voices like that in Israel, repudiating democracy. In the American Jewish community, we're seeing the opposite trend, but to my mind, it's really part of the same broad phenomenon of a one-dimensional understanding of Israel and of Jewish identity generally. And what we're seeing in America are more and more young Jews questioning the moral legitimacy of a Jewish state. And what worries me really is the intensification of these two trends, pulling apart the twin pillars of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. And what we're fighting for now in Israel, with you as well, is for those two flags on the bima. Because if, God forbid, we become a Jewish version of Hungary or Poland or Turkey, or even worse, some kind of strange combination of Iran and Hungary, and maybe throw in Lebanon into the mix, a dysfunctional country. You mentioned tribes, a dysfunctional society divided by tribes. Then there's no basis anymore for a relationship. And we are, for all practical purposes, North American Jewry and Israel are the Jewish people. We're basically what's left. There are wonderful Jewish communities around the world, but 90% of the Jews today live either in Israel or in North America. And I think that demographic trend is just going to intensify in the coming decades. So if we can't get this relationship right, then that means that the Jewish people is going to be dysfunctional. And that's another aspect of what we're fighting for now. And so for me, this moment presents us with a very stark choice. And either American Jews are going to walk away from Israel, or they're going to redouble their involvement with Israel and say, this is precisely the moment when I have to get involved, because the Israel that I love and care about is in mortal threat. And when you love someone, even if that person is in danger, even if that is a self-inflicted threat, you still draw closer to that person. You try to protect someone or something you love. And it seems to me this is really a moment of truth for the diaspora-Israel relationship. And to pull away now is really to, in a sense, to say that, well, we're in it only when Israel brings pride to Jews, only when it gives us nachas. If Israel isn't giving me nachas, then if you're not doing an Entebbe or rescuing Ethiopian Jews, then I'm not interested. And that's not a real relationship. That's not love.
Right.
And so I'm looking toward those in the diaspora who truly love and care about Israel to stand up and say, this is the moment to fight for those two flags on the bima.
Well, thank you so much for that in-depth kind of framing of the two communities and their mirror image kind of relationships right now. But I do think in the American Jewish community, and this may be speaking a little bit of the community I come from, but there is a very engaged pro-Israel community in America. It tends to be the more traditional community. And just like in Israel, where 40 years ago, Kahana would go on into the Knesset and everyone would turn their back. And now we have Ben Gvir and Smotrich and all these people are completely normalized and have, as Amir said earlier, potentially they really are the ones controlling the government. That happened in the same trajectory in the US community, in the very engaged with Israel community, whether it's the day school community, the Zionist camp community, year in Israel to go to, make sure you go to Israel, your year in the Gush, prominent American rabbis in the modern Orthodox community parroting the same politics of the Midrasha, the Mechina before the army in Israel, that's very right wing, which ultimately was like a very pro-settlement politics. And that if you didn't immediately, it's so much so that it meant that had to be your American politics. It would be one issue voter in the US, only for the Republicans. And it creates a binary within the US community that maybe is very similar to the binary in the Israeli community between right and left. And it has made it very hard to have discussions and to try to get people, everyone's immediately branded a leftist if you show any daylight between you and the current Israeli government. And you're dealing with that in Israel right now. So do you have advice for us as an American community on how to try to have an intervention within the very dedicated Zionist communities in America to help them see that supporting democracy and supporting the arguably millions of Israelis who've been protesting is being pro-Israel? How do we do that?
Well, let's first of all begin with the terminology. Let's begin with the terminology, because Netanyahu has tried to depict the protests as the left, even the far left. And initially, in the early weeks of the demonstrations, he used to tweet pictures of the handful of Palestinian flags that some far leftists would bring and would be on the fringes of our demonstrations. And he would do that to try to discredit the entire protest movement as not quite patriotic. Now, there certainly is a left-wing presence in the protest movement. I'm very grateful to the Israeli left. I think that the Israeli left deserves tremendous credit especially since the Second Intifada, for keeping alive the idea of a two-state solution in Israeli discourse. But I personally don't come from the left. I don't identify with the left. I'm very much in the center of Israeli politics. And my strong sense is that the majority of the people out on the streets week after week are also coming from the center. And another major difference between Israeli political discourse and the American situation is that if you look at the symbol of the protest movement, it's the Israeli flag. And we have thousands of Israeli flags at every demonstration. And that's something that I think is very hard to translate into a contemporary American context, where the right has appropriated the symbols of patriotism, of love of country. And I think that that's one of the disasters that's happened in American political discourse, is that, and in an American context, I think it is fair to talk about left versus right. And I think the left made an enormous tactical mistake in conceding the symbols of American patriotism to the right. So in terms of trying to reach the center, right of center, pro-Israel community, the first thing to make clear is that what's happening in Israel today is not left versus right. There's very little left in Israeli politics. The Labor Party, which is the founding party of the state of Israel, the party that governed uncontested for the first 3 decades of the state, today is the smallest faction in parliament. 4 seats out of 120. It's simply unbelievable. And according to every poll that I've seen recently, Labor is not getting into the Knesset in the next elections. And so you do have Meretz, and presumably Meretz, which is farther to the left, will come in place of Labor if Labor doesn't make it. But we're really talking about 4 or 5 seats. It's negligible. And so this specter of the left haunting Israeli politics is really Netanyahu's war against ghosts. Netanyahu is fighting his father's ghosts against the left, against an all-powerful Zionist left, which doesn't exist anymore, and it hasn't existed for years, certainly not since the Second Intifada. And so I think that we need to make clear that and not allow Netanyahu to determine the language of reference for what's happening in Israel today. There have been protests happening in some settlements. They're small protests, but there have been demonstrations in Efrat, in Ma'ale Adumim, in Ariel. This is really important to be emphasized. Now, when I look at the mainstream American Jewish community, the mainstream pro-Israel community, I'm speaking about the AIPAC community, AJC, ADL. I understand their hesitation for getting involved in what they fear is an internal Israeli debate. I don't believe for a moment that this is an internal Israeli debate. This is an issue for the Jewish people, and I'll explain why I believe that in a moment. But I think that that we Israelis have played a duplicitous game with the diaspora for many years. What we've told diaspora Jews is, if you support my camp, whatever my camp is, left, right, center, settlers, Peace Now, New Israel Fund, if you support my camp, you're not interfering in Israeli internal affairs. You're simply strengthening the camp that is working for the survival and well-being of Israel. But if you dare support the other camp, how dare you interfere in Israeli politics? Your children don't go to the army. You will, and then suddenly we start piling on that whole number, the guilt. But as long as you support my side, it's fine. And so I think we need to start changing the ground rules of the diaspora-Israel relationship and own up to a very basic premise of Zionism, which is that we created a state for two peoples, for the Jewish people and the Israeli people. For the Jewish people, and that means that any Jew anywhere around the world has a stake in Israel. Israel is on some level the state of every Jew, whether or not they're citizens. And it is the citizen of every state, it is the state of every citizen of Israel, whether or not they're Jews. That's how I understand Jewish and Israeli. These are two identities that Zionism took responsibility for. But if we took responsibility for Israel as the center point of a transnational Jewish people, then we need to own the consequences of that. And that means making a place at the table in whatever form for a diaspora voice. Now, there are organizations in the American Jewish community whose opinions really annoy me about Israel. But I want to hear them. I need to hear them. Because if I'm not going to hear them from my fellow Jews, then how am I going to hear what I look like in the world, how I project? And so diaspora Jews not only have the right to interfere in our internal affairs, they have a responsibility to. Now, it's true that if mainstream Jewish organizations take a stand on our internal issues, the other camp is going to accuse them of interfering in our internal affairs. The opportunity of this moment is that you have a very large popular Israeli movement that is turning to the diaspora and saying, we want to develop a new relationship with you. We're not only interested in your money, we're interested in you. We want your involvement, we want your opinions. This is new in the relationship. And I think we need to take advantage of that. Now, I mentioned earlier, a moment ago about why I believe this issue is different than anything we faced before. And that is that what's at stake here is not another policy issue. We are fighting for the basic identity of Israel, the identity of Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state. And what that means is there are two ideas about what it means to be a democratic state and what it means to be a Jewish state. On a democratic state, you heard Amir lay it out. There's the camp that believes winner take all, which is this government. Democracy is simply about an election every 4 years, hopefully, and that's it. And whoever wins can trample on democratic norms. And then there is the liberal camp, which believes that democracy is a complicated dance between majority rights and minority rights. And the second issue, and then I'll just finish with this point, is what do we mean by a Jewish state? And this, I think, is really important for diaspora Jews to understand. This is the first government in Israel's history that identifies a Jewish state with Judaism. Israel is a Jewish state because it is the state of Judaism. The classical Zionist idea, which was adopted by every Israeli government, left, right, and center, is that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, not of Judaism, and certainly not of one denomination of Judaism. This government is betraying everything that we always believed about what it means to be a democratic state and what it means to be a Jewish state.
Thank you so much for that kind of a hopeful way of thinking about the possibilities of a new relationship between Israelis and American Jews. Speaking of the relationship between Israel and America, I just want to turn back to Amir for a second and ask him kind of a really, I'm sure you don't know the answer to this because it's asking you to read a crystal ball, but if there is the constitutional crisis you're predicting that could happen is if the court goes in one way and the government chooses not to follow the court. Do you believe that there will be an existential threat to the relationship and the special relationship between the US and Israel to the point of everything from cutting off aid to really a fissure that may not be repairable?
I don't see something like that happening in the immediate term because I think, first of all, President Joe Biden is a Zionist and deeply loves Israel. And he belongs to an older generation of Democrats who have a strong emotional connection to Israel. And I cannot imagine him taking such extreme measures. And then there's also a political calculation. Next year is an election year in the United States. The competition between Biden and former President Trump right now looks pretty rough. And so I think he will try to minimize confrontations and tensions with Israel as much as he can. I do believe the long-term damage will be severe because Joe Biden is the last member politically of that generation of Democrats in the party's current leadership. I mean, there's also Chuck Schumer as the Senate Majority Leader, but I think, he's also probably not going to be there in a few years from now. Nancy Pelosi also, we know she's still a member of Congress, but not leading the party anymore. And we do see that the new emerging leadership in the Democratic Party is still supportive of Israel and still supportive of the US-Israel relationship, but is also much more attuned to other voices that are raising within the Jewish community, first of all, and Yossi spoke about that a bit, and so did you, Victoria, but also broadly in American society. And we do see in public opinion polls in the United States that the younger you are, the less attached you are to Israel today. This is something that is cutting through all demographics, including, by the way, even evangelical Christians. There have been several polls done in the last decade that clearly show that even among this demographic, which is supposedly the most pro-Israeli one, younger people are more critical of Israel and more aware of the problems we have here. And a government that is going to, first of all, break apart the constitutional order that exists in Israel, and by doing that, erode the shared democratic values that are supposed to connect US and Israel, and will do that in order to promote extreme measures and policies like, for example, annexing the entire occupied territories without giving civil rights to Palestinians, expanding the existing settlements to a place where you are making a two-state solution even theoretically impossible. I mean, we can argue whether it's possible today in reality, but this government has elements within it that want to make it even theoretically impossible. It's completely buried. These kinds of policies will eventually lead us to a place where we have a major crisis with the United States and a growing faction within the Democratic Party that does not want the special relationship with Israel anymore. Now, we also have to look at what's happening on the Republican side. On the Republican side today, there is a growing faction that is isolationist in its foreign policy view and is against security assistance to other countries more broadly. We see right now there are a lot of Republicans who are against giving aid to Ukraine, for example, even though Ukraine is doing something that in the past was the most obvious thing any Republican politician would have supported. It's fighting Russia, and it's keeping Russian influence at bay in Europe. And if we go back to the days of Ronald Reagan, this is, at the end of the day, the heart of what Republican foreign policy and national security policy used to be back then. But today there is an isolationist tendency, and we're seeing a lot of Republicans who are criticizing Biden for giving aid to Ukraine. I can certainly imagine a growing faction within the Republican Party saying the same thing 5 or 10 years down the road about aid to Israel. And so if we're going towards a situation where the Israeli government is eroding the shared values basis, and we're having these growing factions on both political parties that don't see the value of continued strong American support for Israel, this is a major problem. A serious Israeli government would have convened a series of discussions at the cabinet level with experts and top advisors on how to prepare for that day and how to prepare for the coming changes in the American political system. What this government is doing, first of all, it's not discussing anything strategic, not on the American policy question, but also not about Israel and China, not about Israel's place in the Middle East, the Palestinian issue. It's a government without any strategy. But worse than that, it's taking all the problems that I just described that should be problems of the future and accelerating them and making them the problems of tomorrow morning, not of 5 years from now, with, again, the prospect of a constitutional crisis and annexation, and just the scorn that you hear from some of the ministers in this government toward President Biden, toward Vice President Harris, toward Democratic members of Congress, and toward the American Jewish community, who many members of this government don't really know, don't appreciate, and don't want to understand. And so I am very concerned about the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship, even though I do not see President Biden taking extreme measures against Israel in the coming year. I think both for his ideological standing and for political reasons, but in the long term, it's very dangerous. And in a way, this government is writing the argument for its opponents in the United States. It is making it much, much easier for them to criticize and attack Israel. And so to American Jews who sometimes are concerned about how the protest movement will impact arguments against Israel in America, and I have conversations like this with Jewish American friends all the time, I tell them that I'm not, I understand their concern, I'm not trying to minimize it, but the damage this government is causing to Israel's standing in the United States and the ammunition this government is giving to Israel's opponents in the United States is the biggest problem.
Well, another encouraging note, hopefully there will be some reasonableness, so to speak, will be coming out of Israel as we see what happens with the Supreme Court cases. Right now, I think we have a little bit of time left for questions from our audience. My colleague and friend Tamar is going to go through some of the questions, and we'll do it as quickly as possible. And there's some for Yossi and some for Amir. And
yeah, so there's an interesting mix here. We have quite a few questions. This is one, I think it's more for Yossi, and it's kind of an afuch al afuch of what you said. It's aren't Kohelet actions a not so great example of U.S. Jewish engagement in Israel? Much as I would like to hear U.S. Jewish voices, there is a risk in encouraging I guess the other side to also interfere. So interesting question, I think.
There's a very useful Hebrew phrase, zemayesh. This is who we are in the aggregate. This is the Jewish people. And if I am inviting diaspora Jews to intervene in Israeli debates, on my side, I have to accept the legitimacy of right-wing American Jews intervening on the other side. I don't like it. Of course, we never like it. But that's part of those are the ground rules of Jewish peoplehood. Those are the ground rules of what it means to take Israel seriously as the center of Jewish life. And so, yes, it will have consequences that I will gnash my teeth over. But I certainly prefer it this way, to have diaspora Jews involved in a more robust relationship than to keep the anemic relationship which we have today, and which is dying. if we don't renew this relationship and make it more meaningful, it's going to die. And so I think that we really are looking at saving the diaspora-Israel relationship.
I just want to add a sentence about that. The good thing, Yossi, is that the right-wing side isn't really asking for anyone's permission, and I don't think they should. But Sheldon Adelson did not ask anyone's permission to put hundreds of millions of dollars into a pro-Netanyahu newspaper. And the supporters of Kohelet, the right-wing think tank promoting the Judicial Overhaul, did not ask anyone on the other side if it was okay for them to support this. They just came and did it. I find these kinds of questions much more often coming from the liberal side in the United States. And it's true that people who are more out on the left don't have these questions, but I think the liberal Zionist mainstream has these, stomach ache feelings around getting involved. And I agree with Yossi that we need to be realistic and look what's happening out there. Other players are already on this field, whether it's people on the far left or people on the right. And the biggest question is what will happen with the sleeping giant known as the liberal Zionist Jewish American majority. So far, we're seeing more of an awakening, and I have a story tomorrow in Haaretz about some events that have happened in recent days with the protest movement in Israel and American Jews. But I think there is still much more that can be done if people realize that if they care about Israel, if they want to have a Jewish democratic country to teach their kids about, or perhaps, have it as a plan B for their kids one day, they need to get off the couch.
I just add to that, it wasn't asked in the Q&A, but I'll let myself say, it's jarring to me a little bit to hear you keep referring to them as right and left when we all in the peace, in the democracy movement, we keep saying we're not right or left. I don't know if you want to address that.
No, what I was trying to say is that there is clearly a right-wing religious element behind this coalition, and there are voices, much more on the left who are sometimes suspicious of the protest movement in Israel because they think Israel was never a democracy because of the occupation. But there is a majority that you can see spanning from the center right to the center left that I think is looking at this a bit confused about what does this mean for Israel and for the US Jewish community. And I think that's the majority that actually could have a huge influence if it decided to get more involved. And it's not going to come as a decision of some kind of an organization. It's going to come from individual people bringing this conversation to their synagogues, to their local JCC, to their Jewish day school, to their local chapter of a Jewish organization, and insisting to have this conversation and to educate people about what's happening and to decide to have a voice about it. It's really going to be thousands of decisions of individuals that will be needed in order to get this Jewish American liberal Zionist majority to get into action and to become involved, like we're seeing from people with other convictions doing.
Right. Okay. Thank you. On another point, Marvin asks, in the upcoming U.S. elections, Republicans will represent themselves as being more supportive of Israel than some Democrats. The current crisis in Israel is not about the territories or a peace process, but about shared democratic values. What's the message that we should be bringing to U.S. elected officials that is supportive of Israel, but not the actions of this government? To either one of you, I guess.
As an Israeli, I feel reluctant to answer questions of that nature. I would leave that to your wisdom. I am technically still an American citizen, but I haven't voted in America in many years. And I don't feel that it's my place to tell American Jews how to deal with their political system, especially on this sensitive issue of American-Israeli relations. I rely on the wisdom of American Jews for figuring out the messaging and getting it across.
I want to add something about this without going into the question of what to tell elected officials, which again, I don't think I have the wisdom to do it. I do know that people in Congress are going to be looking at the American Jewish community to understand where the conversation is going. And a lot of times the American Jewish community has the ability to lead the conversation around issues related to Israel. And so putting aside the question of Congress for a second, for the American Jewish community itself, what is happening right now in Israel presents a huge opportunity, because Israel for many years was only associated with wars and conflict and occupation and settlements and the debate we have around those issues. But right now there is a huge movement in Israel of people from different political positions who are fighting for liberal values, who are fighting for democracy. And this is a huge opportunity to connect young American Jews especially, but the broader Jewish community itself, to Israel through this movement. And I believe in the debate about being pro-Israel, what does it mean? How does it manifest? There is also an opportunity here, because there is a way to come and say, I support and I love Israel, and I have a lot of criticism of the current extreme government. And one way to do that is, again, by supporting these protests and doing things that relate to them. And so I believe that if the voice of the Jewish community will go more and more in that direction, it will also impact the broader conversation in the United States. Because politicians, at the end of the day, they look at their constituents on a lot of issues to understand which way the wind is blowing. And this is something that I think the voice of the American Jewish community matters much more in a way than the voice of this or that member of Congress, or even, I would say, the voice of President Biden. At the end of the day, what American Jews are going to be saying about this will dictate the terms of the conversation.
Interesting. Okay. A little bit of a different slant. How can we have such discussions without hearing from the main victims of the current coup, the Palestinians? Why are we continuing to have Jewish internal conversations when half of the population under Israeli control is not Jewish?
So I'd say there are several ways of approaching this question. The first is practical, and that is that the way in which this movement will succeed is if we appeal to as broad a political spectrum in Israel as possible. Amir mentioned a kind of a consensus that is emerging. We certainly see it in the polls, from moderate right to moderate left. And that is the coalition that has the best chance, really the only chance, of replacing this government. Now, I need the soft right. I need the Likud voters who are becoming disillusioned with this government on my side. The moment we start waiving the issue of occupation, you lose the entirety of that soft right flank. So on practical grounds, I think that is a disaster. It sometimes seems to me that the Jewish left, parts of the Jewish left, would rather be right than smart. We had a famous slogan in Israel about road safety many years ago. On the road, don't be right, be smart. And I think that one of the reasons why the left has lost so fundamentally in Israel is because it has conveyed this sense of we'd rather be right than smart. And this is a classic example of that. Let me use an unpleasant example.
Yossi, if I could just ask you to talk a little bit closer to the microphone, a little bit.
Let me
Thank
use
you.
an unpleasant example. If a cancer patient who's undergoing chemotherapy suddenly gets a massive heart attack you deal with the heart attack first. You don't worry about the cancer at that moment. The occupation is a long-term cancer. If we were to put the occupation on our banner, nothing would change. The left might feel better about it. It would not change the situation at all, and we would lose a good part of our support. We're trying to save the Supreme Court, which is the last line of defense for human rights, including for the Palestinians, but especially for the Arab-Israeli minority. And so this is a time to be strategic. It's a time not to be ideological. And there are people, organizations on the Jewish left whose instinct is ideological. And this protest movement is succeeding because it is aiming at as broad a constituency as possible.
I want to add something about that. My
please.
personal position in the debate about the occupation in Israel is much more on the left than most Jewish Israelis today. And I think it's very important to talk about the occupation and to talk about what's happening in the occupied territories. But I don't think it should be the main issue related to this legislation. This legislation is dangerous because it touches on so many different elements. And one of them is the occupation. This legislation would, if completed, right, we've seen one main law passed, the Reasonableness Standard, canceled for government decision, that could impact policies in the occupied territories. It could also impact corruption in general in Israel. It could lead to unreasonable decisions that have to do with budget allocation. It could empower extremist forces religiously inside Israel. And that is true for all the other components of the legislation as well, giving the government control over all the judicial appointments. So yes, you will see appointments of judges who will never accept any kind of a case from any Palestinian about any injustice being done to them. You will also see corrupt judges who will give the government its way on any issue. And you will also see judges who will accept legislation and executive decisions that hurt my rights and Yossi's rights and the rights of women in Israel and LGBT and Arab citizens. So to come and say that this has nothing to do with the occupation is not true, because definitely there will be an impact on the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories. To say that this is only about the occupation is also not true. This legislation is so dangerous, it could have an impact on the rights of millions of people, whether it's Palestinians in the occupied territories or Israeli citizens of all kinds. And it will also have an impact on American interests, because a more extreme Israel, where there is no court that can balance and be a check on the government, will lead to more extreme decisions and measures. And then that will all be put on the desk of the American ambassador in Jerusalem and the American Secretary of State. Today, the Supreme Court in Israel in many ways acts as a babysitter sometimes for the far right in Israel. And Netanyahu, in his older version, before he decided to adopt these attacks on the court, he actually found that comfortable. He always knew that crazy decisions and policies from his far right partners will stop in the Supreme Court, and there will be some kind of a babysitter there. Without the Supreme Court, who will be the babysitter for the far right in Israel? The United States. And this will be disastrous for the US-Israel relationship if every crazy policy and decision will become an issue of the American administration to deal with. And so the occupation is part of this conversation, as it should be, but it's not the main banner. I agree with Yossi. There are many dangers coming out of the moves this government wants to do. Some of them have to do with the Palestinian arena, some of them don't at all. And I think the question here is, can we build a front? Can we build a civil resistance front to this legislation that, yes, includes people on the left? And by the way, one of the failures of the movement so far in Israel is that it does not include many Arab citizens of Israel, who will also be impacted by the legislation. But we need to build some kind of a front that stretches from the left to the moderate right, like Yossi said. And this requires a lot of smart politics and a lot of tactical decisions that for some people will be hard to stomach. But without amassing that kind of a civil resistance front that goes from the moderate right to the left, it will be impossible to stop the government. This is how I view it.
So I wanted to thank both of you so much for your time and your expertise. And I think we've learned so much about, when you say civil resistance, that this is really about creating a new paradigm. It's not left and right. It's not Israelis versus Americans. It's really about creating a full panoply of all of our Jewish identities, all of our politics, to fight for our shared values, which is democracy, both here and in Israel. And for our audience, inspiring that we actually, as American citizens who care about Israel, have the ability to have a disruption in both conversations by being active and being involved. So we really encourage you to please join us, including next week, where we have another wonderful webinar, which tomorrow will be hosting with Ehud Barak. We're going to have many of them coming soon, many opportunities to have to join us in all different ways. Whatever your skills and interests are, please volunteer. We need you. And it's really is now or never. If not now, when? It's in our hands. So please, thank you so much. Have a good Elul.
Feel free to join our many channels, all the social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, website, Instagram, everything. And thank you both to Yossi and Amir. It was really great. And I have to tell you that the longer we sit here, the more questions we're getting in the Q&A. So we'll probably invite you again.
Shana
Thank you
Tova.
very, very much. Toda rabba.
Shana Tova. Yesh hada zua.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye, everybody.